Now, go to chapter 28, and Saul, we switch stories to the parallel story. David is not at a good place. This has always been one of those stories that bug me. If this person you're going to has real spiritual power, follow me here on this. You're walking into a place that's a soothsayer because they have the ability to see into the eternal, but they can't see past my wax nose. Is anybody else bugged by this? I mean, honestly, either you're stupid because this person's a huckster, or if they're real, they're gonna spot you, okay? But so this story has always made me a little bit crazy, but it just shows you that Saul, who started out resistant to what God wanted him to, ended up what God wanted him is called to be, ended up resistant to God himself. Remember, when you first meet Saul, he's hiding in the baggage. He's first chasing donkeys, but then when you first meet him at the coronation, he's hiding in the baggage, reluctant to be king. By the end of the story, he's reluctant to follow God on any level at all. He's now blatantly going after the things that God told him not to do. Can anybody remind me of in the simplest terms possible, of the Deuteronomic command concerning those who would breach the afterlife, i.e. witches or spiritists? Kill them, okay? It is not complicated. You don't go, I wonder what he means by kill them. So let's get down to chapter 28. Somebody read the first 5 verses nice and loud.
Now it came about in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camp for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, know assuredly that you will go out with me in camp, you and your men. David said to Achish, very well, you shall know that what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well. Very well, you shall know what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had lamented him and buried him in Ramah, his own city. And Saul had removed from the land those who were mediums and spiritists. So the Philistines gathered together and came and camped in Chinum. And Saul gathered all Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly.
Okay. I want you to notice some conditions of the day. Condition number 1, Dave's on the wrong team. Why is Dave on the wrong team? Because Dave made a series of decisions that ended up with him on the wrong team. So in verses 1 and 2, you have Dave on the wrong team. He's now going to be bodyguard for the enemy of Israel. This is really not the career move when you want to end up being king of Israel, right? So let's say he's made some pretty bad career moves. And in verse 3, in addition to Dave on the wrong team, Samuel's on the eternal team. That is, he died. He's gone. So this religious icon, this Billy Graham-sized figure, is now gone. And there's a sense of the psyche of Israel where something was lost. I'm not saying everybody was all that religious. I already said that. They're not. But sometimes the symbolism matters, and it seems like this symbol is gone now. Now you go to verse 4, and now you see we're coming now to a head between two things. Dave on the wrong side, and the Philistines now going to attack the people that David wants to rule over. That's going to bring about a problem. But we also have another condition. Saul, verse 5, is famously in fear mode. Saul has always been somewhat in fear mode, but he's at his best when he's really shaking. And what Saul tends to do when he gets afraid is try to find somebody else to fit in his armor so that he can somehow sit this one out. Now, without Samuel to consult, without David to chase, all that Saul has are the memories of the past where Samuel said, God's going to tear this kingdom out of your hands. And he's got the fear of the future and no one to turn to. You can despise all the people in your life until you're down to none. And that's what Saul did. Now you pick up the story, and it says, Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. Saul is quaking. Saul is nervous. What is Saul doing that's wrong? He's turning to the Lord. He's asking the Lord. He is praying, God, tell me the answer to my problem. God was up in heaven going, not listening, not listening, not listening. Pray all you want, not listening. Do you remember that before Samuel died, he looked at Saul and said, God will not hear you anymore. I'm done. This is the part of the message that churches are afraid to say. Let me say this very clearly. In a relationship, in a wedding, in your own relationship to your spouse, you can do something so bad you'll never repair the marriage. Does everybody agree with that? Can you go beyond reparable in a marriage? I'm not saying God can't from heaven make a miracle. I'm saying in the normal frame of human life, can you do something so bad that it's done? Okay. In parenting, can you, in raising your child, do something to that child that is so bad that you break the relationship, that aside from God reigning on high, making a miracle change, you will not fix this? So you think it's possible to do it in a marriage, and you think it's possible to do it with children. But because of the way Christians are wired, we don't think it's possible to do it to God. And that's not true. God can say, look, I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to do this. I want you to go this way. If you go this way, we are going to be done, you and I. I will strip from you your kingdom. I will take it away. Not I'll take away my love for you. Not I won't be your God anymore. He'll always be your God. That's who he is. The question is, will you always have the place and privilege you have? You can actually get to the place where you throw away the privilege and you can't get it back. And God had already said to him all the way back in chapter 15, if you will not obey me, I will stop talking to you. Now, here's the words I want you to have in your mind, if not in your margin. When we stop listening, God promises to stop talking. He is under no obligation to keep talking at you when you don't want to listen to what he's saying. So what he'll do is he'll just stop talking. And that in and of itself is such a horrible thing, because you lose that sense. If you've had a walk with God and suddenly you're crying out to him and he's not answering you, it's because you understand something. You know something's missing and you cannot get it back. Now, honestly, at that point, Samuel had already told Saul that this had happened, that you are going to be stripped of your kingdom and God will not accept your requests anymore. Do you remember he begged him, can you go worship with me one more time? And he did. But after that he said, now that's it. And Samuel did not see him the rest of his life. That's 15. Now come back to the story, and here's what Saul decides to do. Saul always decides that when being who he is doesn't work, he should look like somebody else. He's not a master of disguise. He's a miserable person in disguise. But verse 7 says, Saul said to his servants, seek for me a woman who is a medium, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servants said, behold, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor. Now, Endor is in the middle of the Jezreel Valley, not far away. But here's the comical part. Earlier it said he had gotten rid of all the spirits and mediums. Now he wants a spirit of medium, and a guy next to him goes, oh yeah, there's one right around the corner over there at Endor. How effective was the got rid of? Okay, I want you to remember that, because you're going to see later on in the Kings will get rid of all of these high places and get rid of these idols, but everybody will know where they are. So the effectiveness of expunging the memory isn't that good, okay? So here's what he says. It says, he says, there's one right over there at Endor, verse 8. Then Saul disguised himself by putting on other clothes and went, he and 2 men with him. And they came to the woman by night. Now you're supposed to see, put on disguise, put on darkness by night. And he said to him, conjure up for me, please, and bring up for me one whom I will name to you. The woman said to him, behold, you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off all those who are spirits and mediums in the land. Why are you then laying a snare for my life to bring about my death? Saul vowed to her by the Lord. Now look at what he does. Here he is in the still of night wearing a disguise, trying to go to a spiritist using God talk. He now whips out the by the Lord's hand. You know, like, really? Pretty much nothing. This is how I feel when I read these folks in the news who who are everything they're saying is unbiblical and ungodly, but they're saying it as leaders in Christendom. Like they're somehow, because they wear the big hat or the uniform, they're somebody in Christ. Here's what it says. Saul vowed to her by the Lord, saying, "As the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing." Now, wait a minute. What you just read was a contradictory statement. God, who says you should die for doing this, will protect you from dying. Does anybody else see a real theological conundrum here? So here's the bottom line. Then the woman said, "Whom shall I bring up?" Well, then fine, if God says, I'll... Wait a minute. Why are you worried if God says, "You're a medium, you're a witch"? So everybody's playing the role that this reverencing of God is somehow important when they're all playing with exactly the opposite of everything biblically he said. Don't be surprised when Satan himself plays Bible and theology, because that's what he does. And here it says, who do you want me to bring up for you? Bring up Samuel for me. It's almost like, dial a prophet or something. Yeah, would you tap me into Sam, please? When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. And the woman spoke to Saul, saying, "Why have you deceived me? For you are Saul." It's interesting. As soon as Samuel appears before her, she sees Samuel. In some part of the exchange, it becomes clear to her who he is. The king said to her, "Do not be afraid, but what do you see?" The woman said to Saul, "I see a divine being coming up out of the earth." Don't get all caught up in the words here. It means a spirit being, one from the other part of the spirit world. I see someone coming from the spiritual side of things. This is a Jacob moment. Here he comes down the stairs now, even as we speak. And he said to her, "What is his form?" She said, "An old man is coming up, and he's wrapped with a robe." And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. Then Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am greatly distressed, for the Philistines are waging war against me, and God has departed from me and no longer answers me, either through the prophets or by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you might make known to me what I should do." Samuel said, "Why then do you ask me, since the Lord has departed from you and has become your adversary? The Lord has done accordingly as he spoke through me. For the Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hand and given it to your neighbor, to David. As you did not obey the voice of the Lord and did not execute his fierce wrath on Amalek, so the Lord has done this thing to you this day. Moreover, the Lord will also give over Israel along with you into the hands of the Philistines. Therefore, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me," as in dead. "Indeed, the Lord will give over the army of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." And Saul immediately fell full length upon the ground and was very afraid because of the words of Samuel, and there was no strength in him, for he had eaten no food all day and all night. The woman came to Saul and saw that he was terrified and said to him, "Behold, your maidservant has obeyed you, and I have taken my life in my hand and have listened to your words which you spoke to me. So now also, please listen to the voice of your maidservant, and let me set a piece of bread before you, that you may eat and have strength before you go your way." But he refused and said, "I will not eat." However, his servant together with the woman urged him, and he listened to them. So he arose from the ground and he sat on the bed. Then the woman had a fattened calf in the house. She quickly slaughtered it, and she took flour, kneaded it, and baked unleavened bread from it. She brought it before Saul and his servants, and they ate. They arose, and they went away that night in physical strength and spiritual depletion. That's how it really ends. The physical part was depleted because the spiritual part was depleted. So they fattened themselves up and ate as if they could somehow relieve the spiritual bankruptcy of the time. The truth of the matter is that the bill comes due. If we continue in hardness, the bill comes due. And what I think is interesting is he goes in cloaked piety and disobedience and deception, using God talks, and even contradicts the Word of God in his whole presentation. And in order for him to get to the truth, he asks Samuel, and Samuel's only words here. Now, is it Samuel, first of all? We don't know. We don't know. Is this Samuel? There is no indication in what Samuel says that this isn't Samuel. But do we know for sure that Samuel is in fact brought back from the spiritual realm? We do not. All we know is that that's what that appears to be Samuel, and the words he uses are words in keeping with what Samuel would say. But don't put all your eggs in one basket as to whether or not he's really him. It doesn't really matter to the story because Saul believes it is. It doesn't really matter to the story because the Lord communicates to Saul through it. If what you wanted to hear was from me, you just heard from me. You're dead. Plan on it. Count on being in the ground by the next day. Now, so what we have is this demise of Saul spiritually, and by the end of chapter 28, you go out of this with a sense that Saul is bankrupt. There's nothing left. He's shaky physically. He's dead spiritually. He's nowhere with God. He's in trouble. But 27 was about David, 28 about Saul, 29 bounces back to David. And now you pick up what was in like 28:2, where we had just a few words about David. Now the Philistines gathered together all the armies of Aphek while the Israelites were camping by the spring which is in Jezreel. And the lords of the Philistines were proceeding on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were proceeding in the rear with Achish. Then the commanders of the Philistines said, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who has been with me these years, or rather these years, and I have found no fault in him for the day he deserted me to me to this day?" But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him, and the commanders of the Philistines said to him, "Make the man go back, that he may return to his place where you have assigned him, and do not let him go to battle with us, or in the battle he may become an adversary to us. For with what could this man make himself acceptable to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of these men?" Now, what's the problem? In the situation, the problem is that he ends up being in the battle against his own people. How does God protect David's reputation? Because God steps in to protect him when David doesn't even know to protect himself. What does he do? They don't want him in the battle. So God stirs the heart of the Philistine commanders to get Achish to have David withdraw, which will in essence save David from a terrible choice. If David kills Israelites and then goes to be king in Judah, the Israelites will never sign on to have one united kingdom because he is a guy with blood of their own brother's blood on his hands. So once again, Dave looks like he's going to act rashly and be willing to kill, and God pulls him back. What Abigail did in the previous story, now the Philistine commanders are doing for him. Let's be open to the idea that sometimes you're too stupid to know whether or not you're about to blow it on your own, and God will send somebody to protect you from you. Okay? He's being protected from himself. And what they use is the strangest thing. It's been in the book since the 15th chapter. That what they use is the slogan or song that made Saul sick. Saul has killed his thousands, David tens of thousands. The Philistines go, "Don't you know the song? Everybody sings about David. Don't you know the song? This is David of the song." Achish called David and said to him, "As the Lord lives, you have been upright. You're going out and coming in with me, and the army are pleasing in my sight. I've not found evil in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, you are not pleasing in the sight of the Lord." What verse 6 doesn't say is, "And you've been lying to me constantly and I haven't found out." That's what it doesn't say. It's true that Dave has been killing people, but not the ones he says he's been killing, and he's been lying to him. If Achish knew that, he would have had him killed. David was playing a dangerous game. "Now, therefore, return and go in peace, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines." David said to Achish, "But what have I done? And what have you found in your servant from the day when I came before you to this day, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? David is showing this incredible overt loyalty to the wrong guy. He said, Achish replied, I know that you are pleasing in my sight, like an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he must not go with us to the battle. Now, then, arise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord, who might come with you. As soon as you have arisen early in the morning and have light, depart. David arose early, he and his men, to depart in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. And the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now, the Philistines are going to win this battle. So it's not like David is going to turn on them and take their cities while they're gone. David has swallowed that as long as Saul lives, there's nowhere for him in Judah. The only place he can go is among the Philistines. So now you have the believer living with the unbelievers against the other believers. That's where we are. If that seems strange to you, here's what I can tell you. David was being disobedient. So a disobedient believer often fits better with unbelievers than with other believers. Does that shock you? No, it shouldn't. What I find so interesting about this story is you're seeing David, Saul, David, Saul, David, Saul. Neither are at a good point here. David has swallowed a lie. Saul has swallowed one as well. When you start studying David's life, the earliest study I ever had was a Sunday school kind of study. And it was like how to paint David as the good guy and Saul as the bad guy. But actually, David, like all of the biblical characters before him, you see the good, the bad, the ugly. God just saved David from the choice that he made. David was going to ruin his reputation by killing some of his own people. But don't think there wasn't a cost to what David did. Because chapter 30 tells you a story that ends with a victory but does not begin with a victory. In fact, it begins with, maybe you'd make a note somewhere at the beginning of 30, this is a problem David never should have had. This all happened because of the disobedience of David. So no, his kingship wasn't ruined, but he was personally threatened. Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negev and on Ziklag and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire, and they took captive the women and all who were in it, both great and small, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire. Their wives, their sons, and their daughters had been taken captive. And David and the people who were with him lifted up their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Do you see a connection? You left off with Saul, who was physically exhausted, emotionally exhausted out of disobedience. Now you have David, who's emotionally exhausted because of disobedience. What was the disobedience? He's on the wrong side. He's living in a Philistine town, working for a Philistine king who's about to go and slaughter the king of Israel, and he's going to be the king of Israel. And as a result, his sin does cost him something. At that moment, Dave thinks his wives and his kids are dead. Everything he has built up to that moment is gone as far as he knows. Now, the writer takes the time to insert the note that they hadn't killed anyone. But I do not believe that they left a note on the ground that said, we burned your tents, don't worry, we didn't kill anyone. I don't think that the men were all sitting there crying about their tents and their stuff. I think they thought their kids and wives were dead. And guess why? Because when they raided the Amalekites, guess what they did? They killed them all. So David's lying and killing spree among the Amalekites and Midianites was coming back to bite him in the butt big time. And now he's standing there recognizing how bad it is, and they're weeping. David's two wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelite and Abigail the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him. Underline, stoning him. Now he's broken because of what he's done, and now the people that are with him are blaming him instead of the people that raided them because of what had happened prior to that. The people were embittered, each one because of his sons and daughters. Now stop. And for the first time in chapters, David comes to his senses. And it says, and I would box it, I would mark it, I would make sure David, right in the middle of this, strengthened himself in the Lord his God. That's what he should have done before he went to Achish in the Philistines. So God's expectation is that when you've done all these wrong things, that if you have not gone beyond the reparable, that you'll stop and turn to God. And by the way, he'll take your life or he won't. He'll take the lives of your family or he won't. But you stop and you turn to God and he says, God, I am wrong. I need your strength. I can't do this. David said to Abiathar the priest, son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. Abiathar brought the ephod to David. David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said to him, pursue, for you will surely overtake them, and you will surely rescue all. There it is. At the moment in which he asked God, God answered him not only the question that he asked, but he answered him the question he really wanted to know. I'll give you back your kids. I'll give you back your families. I'll give you back your wives. So David went, he and his 600 men who were with him, came to the brook Besor, that's down by Beersheba in the Negev in the south, where those left behind remain, and David pursued. He and 400 men, and 200 men were too exhausted to cross the brook Besor, and they remained behind. Now they found an Egyptian in the field, and brought him to David, and gave him bread, and he ate, and they provided him water to drink. They gave him a piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins. He ate them. Then his spirit revived, meaning the sugars went to him, and he started to wake up. For he had not eaten or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So David said to him, to whom do you belong, and where are you from? And he said, I am a young man of Egypt, the servant of an Amalekite. My master left me behind when I fell sick 3 days ago. We made a raid on the Negev of the Kerethites, and on that which belongs to Judah, and on the Negev of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag with fire. And there it is. So God, through this young Egyptian who got sick, communicated to David all of the intel that he needed. David said to him, will you bring me down to this band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master, and I will bring you down to this band. When he had brought him down, behold, they were spread over the land, eating, drinking, dancing, because of all the great spoil that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and from the land of Judah. David slaughtered them from the twilight until the evening of the next day. Not a man of them escaped, except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. So David recovered all that the Amalekites had taken and rescued his 2 wives, but nothing of theirs was missing, whether great or small, sons or daughters, spoil or anything that they had taken for themselves. David brought it all back. So David had captured all the sheep and the cattle, which the people drove ahead of the other livestock. And they said, this is David's spoil. Now stop. The point in which David came back and bounced back was the point in which he realized that he had caused the sin and caused the results and consequences. He's standing there looking at the burned tents of Ziklag, knowing that they were burned because of him. And his own men are turning on him, and he knows it's not the men's fault, it's his. This is one of the last big lessons to David as he learns to be king. And each one of these lessons is powerful and important. And what he learns is, I cannot solve my problems myself. The strength that I need will come from the Lord. And if I don't get it from there, I'm getting it from the wrong source. And if I get it from the wrong source, it'll take me to the wrong conclusion. Now, in verses 21 and following, I go through 21 to 31, and what I see in the last part of the passage is that David's now going to divide up among the men the things that he wants them to have. And it says in verse 21, David divides up spoil, but he also now accumulates a series of clans or families that make up Judah. Okay? So as all the places he is, the men that were sent back with him are no longer Philistines. It's only Judahites now with him. And as he divides it up, he essentially cedes the land with the landowners and the stock owners of Judah, because very soon he's going to be king. And what's he king over? Not all Israel, first Judah. And so what's going to happen is that story, God used something that was his own disobedience to usher him right into a powerful position. He was able to hand out large amounts of cash and prizes to people that became the backbone of all the people who sat, if you want to do a little Arthurian thing, sat at his round table with him. So all of his key leaders will be derived out of this thing that happens. Why is that important to you? Well, cut all the way through it. Did he get there because he did right? No. But did God take what he did wrong and turn it into something that was the critical advantage for him? Yes. You don't get to the point when, because you've done wrong things, where you say, well, now that I've done that wrong, I might as well just not go back to God. No, wait a minute. You go back to God, and it's possible that even the fruits of the things that you've done wrong will come out to your own advantage. You don't know that. But one of the things the enemy will do is he will scream into your ear, it's too late to turn back to God. It's too late. You've already done all these things wrong, Dave. Now you've been with Achish. You've been being for years he was in the Philistine camp. And yet God paid back and set the backbone of everything he was about to be. Now when you I want to switch the scene in the next few moments before we take a break, switch the scene and go to 31, and let's see how Saul's end is. Because David's end is, and cash and prizes go to all the backbone people that will make up his kingdom, and David is sitting on a pile of new wealth. That's the end of 30. Now, we're going to have another pile, and we're going to have another end in 31, but it's not going to be the same kind of end. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa, up in the south end of the Jezreel Valley. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines killed Jonathan, Benadab, Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle went heavily against Saul. The archers hit him. He was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, draw your sword, pierce me through with it, otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me. But his armor-bearer would not. He was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell upon it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, and all his men on that day together. And when the men of Israel who were on the other side of the valley, with those who were beyond the Jordan, saw that the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. And the Philistines came and lived in them. And it came about on the next day, when the Philistines came out to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head, stripped off his weapons, sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. By the way, that's in retribution for the sword of Goliath that was sent through the children of Israel. And now it says, and they put his weapons in the temple of Ashtaroth. They fastened his body to the wall of Beit She'an. This is a city and a wall that I'll show you when you're in Israel. And when the inhabitants of Jabesh of Gilead heard that the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men rose, walked up all night, took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Beit She'an, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. They took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh and fasted 7 days. And so Saul, who was characteristically sitting under trees, ends up with his bones now resting permanently under the trees. Here's the thing about this. When Saul walked away from God back in 15. He left the door open not only as a king to his own demise, but to his sons, not only to his sons, but also to his nation. Leaders don't have the same flexibility that other people do. When leaders make mistakes, other people fall with them. Saul caused the retreat of God's people. That's what he did. Saul's disobedience closed off avenues of testimony even to the people that were loyal to him. So his sons die in verse 2 because of his sin. The reason God turned the throne over to David was because of Saul's sin. That's clear in 15. But it also had a lasting effect on Jonathan. It also had a lasting effect on Abinadab. The other guys got deposed of being princes because of Saul's sin. What's interesting is it shocks us when good men like Jonathan die. But here's the thing. He's a prince. He's loyal to God. He's a faithful soldier. He's loyal to his wicked father. He's loyal to his friend David. He's a man who trusted God. He's a man who could be trusted by others. Yet he dies on the same day in the same battle as his evil father. It doesn't seem fair that good people like Jonathan die because of bad people's sin. It doesn't seem fair. But the economy under which we are living is one that says there are graphic consequences to sin, and Saul's sin played out on his children. By the way, don't you think for a moment that that's not what we're going to see rippling through our society in every direction. The adults that refuse to act like adults right now are raising up the next children, and the children will pay for it. That is going to happen. It is happening in front of our eyes. When 2/3 of American children don't grow up in the homes of their two biological parents, we are going to reap a whirlwind for this. And everyone's going to disconnect all of the effect from the cause. Why? Because if we attach it back to the cause, somehow we'll have to fix the cause. That's what's going on. I want you to be very, very careful. Saul wasn't just lying. Listen, he was deceived. When he looked at Samuel and said, I obeyed the Lord, I think he thought he did. And then when Samuel says, then what is bleating of sheep on yonder hill that I hear? Oh, we saved the best. Saul, did you not hear me? Here's the problem. There's a difference between a lie and deception. Spiritual deception is something that's so well cloaked in a cloud, you can't see that it's not true. And people will die believing their deceived version of something is the truth. Be careful. Saul's end was an end that was sad. One of the interesting things, I think, is that people ended up hearing of the humiliation of Saul's life. And God tugged on the hearts in verse 12 of people from Jabesh of Gilead to go take his body down, not simply because it would be an embarrassment to Israel. I truly believe that not everything about Saul was hateable. I think he wasn't an all bad guy. Remember we had a few chapters where he actually did a few good things? I think Saul had the potential. The biggest problem of his life was he started off uncomfortable in his own skin and ended up receiving a deception. Let me end Saul's life with this statement. Your identity is at the core of your character. You have to know who you are. And if you frame your identity wrongly, you'll be sucked into deception. Your identity is at the core of your character. Know who you are. And along with that, know whose you are. Because I think that is at the center of who you are. Let me say it this way. As a child of God, that frames all my other choices. How many of you came from a family whose family taught you what goes on in this house stays in this house? I don't mean in a bad way or a deceptive way. I mean at my table, my father would say very clearly, y'all fight amongst yourselves, but it stays right here in this house. You don't go out there talking bad-mouthing brothers and stuff. You don't do it. And I also learned that there was this secret barrier. Others can, you can't, you're a Smith. My dad probably said it 1,000 times. Others can, you can. I remember when I was serving papers and I desperately wanted to quit that paper route, and my father said, "You're a Smith, we don't quit." "Dad, I'm not making any money." "I don't care, you're a Smith, we don't quit. Find a way to make money." So I did. And here's the thing, I thank my father for the pushing me to do what I would not have done. I don't want to be out there in the cold and the rain. I want to be indoors, living off of you and Mom. But I'm really thankful because naturally I would have done the other. Hard work comes because of training to do hard work. Okay? Any other thoughts on Saul? How many of you got the kind of the interposing between David, Saul, David, Saul, David, Saul? Very often, here's what I want you to do. Somewhere make a mental note. Those two stories are related. They're entangled. And so often what God is doing in David, the next chapter, he'll show an echo of it in Saul and back and forth. And I find that to be fascinating